In this video, we're going to be taking a look at topic 9.8, invasive species. Species may move into new habitats for a number of reasons. They may do so as they search for food or water. It could be that those habitats provide the appropriate mating grounds for them to reproduce, or perhaps it happens to be their preferred climate. It's also possible that they may move into new habitats that were previously unoccupied by them and therefore have unexploited resources. When species immigrate or are transported into a habitat that they aren't native to, they're considered exotic species. Exotic species, if they begin to negatively impact the environment or cause economic harm to that area, would then be considered invasive. In this video, we're going to be looking at the impacts that invasive species have on natural ecosystems. Non-native species may be transported and introduced to new habitats by a number of means. It may occur naturally, say, for example, by animals carrying seeds, or by wind or water currents transporting organisms from one place to another. As a matter of fact, one of the hypotheses that suggests how coconuts so successfully colonized a number of islands of the South Pacific states that they floated there, traveling on ocean currents, reaching those distant islands. But what this video is going to focus on is not those natural means of transport, but by human means of transport. We are responsible for transporting organisms to new habitats both intentionally and unintentionally. The intentional transport includes examples like the cane toad, or the use of kudzu as a soil erosion measure. However, it's almost impossible for us to make accurate predictions about what the consequences of those introductions would be. It's really difficult for us to understand what all of the possible repercussions are, what all of the possible causes and effects are of the introduction of a single species. How many other species will it impact? What kinds of animals will be impacted by it? What kinds of plants? Even soil bacteria and fungi can be affected by the introduction of new species. Species introduction is also sometimes accidental. A really great example that illustrates this is the use of ballast water in ships. An empty cargo ship is inherently unstable and dangerous on the open ocean. So what the ships do is they pump in seawater into containment areas that will help to stabilize the ship out on the open ocean when it's not carrying any cargo. Unfortunately, whatever organisms are present in that water are also being pumped into the ballast, and ultimately when the ballast is expelled at the destination port, whatever organisms are in that water have now been transported potentially over thousands and thousands of kilometers. Not all introduced non-native species are considered invasive, but there are some characteristics of non-native species that make them more likely to become invasive, resulting in environmental and economic harm. This bullet list here outlines some of those features. Most invasive species tend to reproduce very, very quickly. They also tend to be R-selected species, which means they're going to reproduce at their intrinsic growth rate. The second feature is that they tend to be pioneer species. That means that they tend to occupy ecosystems earlier before any other organisms have arrived. They also tend to be relatively long-lived, meaning that they may reproduce more than one time in their life cycle. They're easily dispersed by wind, water, or animals, so they spread very quickly. The fact that they're generalists means that they can take advantage of multiple kinds of resources in the environment and aren't limited to utilizing only specific resources. And finally, they usually have a high level of genetic variability. Having a lot of genetic variation makes them more resistant and resilient to disturbances, giving them greater survivability. But the ability of a non-native species to become invasive is not limited to its own characteristics, but the habitat it's occupying as well. There are some habitats that, because of particular circumstances or features that they have, make them more susceptible to hosting an invasive species. Here are a list of features of those kinds of habitats. Habitats that have climates that are similar to the invading species. If that habitat doesn't have any predators that might prey on the invasive species. If the habitat is in the early stages of succession and is open to those pioneer species. Also, habitats that have a relatively low biodiversity are more susceptible to invasive species. A lack of fire and disturbances caused by humans also increase the possibility that non-native species can become invasive in a habitat. As non-native species become invasive, there are a number of environmental consequences that result. The first and probably most obvious and immediate ones is that the native population sizes are going to shrink. The reason why this occurs is because invasive species are capable of sequestering nutrients far more quickly than the native ones can. That allows their populations to grow much faster than the native species because the native ones are simply being outcompeted for those resources. Ultimately, it's a possibility that some native species may be completely eliminated from a habitat. This reduction in biodiversity opens up the habitat to even more environmental damage because, as we learned earlier in the year, the greater the biodiversity of a habitat, the more resistant and resilient it is to environmental disturbances that may occur in the future. Another environmental effect of invasive species causes harm to what's called the fire regime for a habitat. The fire regime of a habitat is a measure of the patterns and the frequencies and severities of naturally occurring wildfires. If a non-native organism makes it easier or more difficult for fires to spread, then that would affect the fire regime. A really interesting example of this is a plant called the Brazilian pepper tree. What this plant does, because of the way in which it grows, is it creates a relatively humid environment under its canopy. This humid environment makes it more difficult for fires to ignite and to spread. So native species that rely on that fire for both propagation and for eliminating small brush underneath those plants no longer have that benefit. The economic damage caused by invasive species is substantial. It's estimated that every year about 1.4 trillion with a T dollars worth of damage are caused by invasive species. That economic damage can be grouped into one of two general categories. The first is the economically useful species and habitats that we rely on for agriculture and tourism. And then the second is the cost that's associated with the eradication or removal of invasive species. The damage that occurs to agricultural crops results in less harvestable material and then therefore fewer profits. There are literally dozens and dozens of examples that could be used here, and I can't possibly go through all of them. So I'm going to choose one in particular. It's an insect called the glassy-winged sharpshooter. The glassy-winged sharpshooter is believed to have been accidentally brought into the U.S., first appearing in the Southwest. And what this organism does is it lays its eggs on the underside of leaves, especially grapevines. Once those eggs hatch, they begin to feed on the leaves themselves, and then, once they become adults, they use their mouthpiece to puncture into the vines of the plants and suck out the nutritious material. So not only do they cause damage themselves, but they're also known to be a vector for a disease that attacks grapevines as well. Tourism and recreational activities like fishing and hunting may also be impacted. If invasive species cause harm to native species that are used in those activities, that can reduce the potential profit from the sale of hunting and fishing permits. Additionally, as invasive species encroach on native habitats, it may affect the aesthetic quality of a habitat also helping to further reduce its recreational use. Finally, the cost it takes to remove or eradicate invasive species may be so extensive that it actually becomes cost prohibitive to do so. In those cases, we generally resort to containment methods or at least slow the spread of an invasive species because their entire removal or eradication is simply not feasible. Now let's take a look at some examples of invasive species. There are many of them. It would be impossible to review every single one of them, so I'm just going to use some of the most infamous ones to review. The first one I want to talk about is a plant called kudzu. Kudzu was first introduced into the United States as a soil erosion control plant because it grew so quickly and its roots were extensive enough in soil that it could help to bind it together. Native to Southeast Asia, it quickly became invasive because of the rate of its growth. It's a vining plant that will grow up into the trees' canopies and will also grow around other structures as well, making it very difficult to contain. The second one I want to talk about are zebra mussels. Zebra mussels are native to lakes and streams in Russia and in the Ukraine and are believed to have been brought here by shipping. These zebra mussels can be transported accidentally on watercraft, and what they end up doing is they end up clogging up plumbing systems and pipes that may be used by dams and other water control systems. Another example I want to talk about are lionfish. Lionfish are stunningly elaborate looking fish that are native to the Indian and South Pacific Oceans. They were first brought here for use as pets in fish tanks, but as they became too difficult to take care of, people would release them out into the marine environment. Because those fish are poisonous, they don't have any natural predators that can therefore prey on them. Where lionfish have become a serious problem is in the Gulf of Mexico, in the northern Caribbean, and along the eastern seaboard. And I can't leave a talk about invasive species without, of course, reminding everyone of our friend the cane toad. The cane toads were brought into Australia to help control a beetle that was infesting the sugarcane crops, but it famously failed. We don't have to look very far, though, to find a bunch of examples of invasive species. We can look right here in the state of Washington and find dozens and dozens of examples. The state of Washington maintains a series of websites on which you can learn a whole bunch more about the invasives here in Washington. Some of the examples include the Asian carp. Down here at the bottom of this list, there's our zebra mussels. As far as insects go, the apple maggot is especially destructive to apple orchards. There's the so-called murder hornet here. And then another famous example is the gypsy moth. When it comes to plants, some of these that you may have heard of, Elodia, which is a water plant. There's also kudzu here. And then down a little farther, Scotch broom, which we have tons of, especially growing along the sides of freeways. I want to end our video look at invasive species by considering diseases as well. It's generally pretty easy for people to think of plants and animals as potentially being invasive if they're introduced to a new area, but there are a number of historical examples of diseases acting as invasive species as well. I'm going to pick two examples from history to help to illustrate that point. The first one is called Dutch elm disease. Dutch elm disease is a disease caused by a fungus that infects elm trees. It was first identified just before World War II in Europe, and because of transportation, made its way to North America by the end of the 1920s. Since the 1980s and 90s, it has successfully traveled pretty much around the globe and has decimated elm tree populations. The second example that I want to use is a disease that affects humans. It's believed that smallpox made its way to North America for the first time in 1520. because the indigenous people of North America had very little resistance to the smallpox virus, their population was decimated by its infection rate. Although it was unintentionally first brought to North America, there are many historical examples of its intentional use to try to attempt genocide on Native American populations. Some estimates sadly state that up to 90% of Native American populations were eradicated by the smallpox virus. Thank you for watching this video on invasive species. Until next time, bye-bye.